I've been a policeman for nearly 34 years. I've been assaulted, I've been hospitalised in the course of my work. My grandfather was a policeman who, I have a photo of him in my office with his arm in a sling after he was stabbed. My father was a policeman. He was assaulted several times despite being 6'3" and 20 stone. And his co-worker and best friend was executed by a criminal with a firearm in 1979. My 19-year-old son graduated into the police force in September this year and has already been subjected to several violent confrontations. In my immediate family, there's 102 years of policing service to the community of Victoria, and I'd like to think I know a little bit about what being a police officer is. Mind you, I've often cursed my grandfather for being a policeman and not being an oil tycoon or a media magnate, and passed on the family curse to us. We can't get a high-paying job. But, the most up-to-date figures that I can quote from in relation to this issue are from the 2008-9 Victoria Police Annual Report and Crime Data, because they match in with the Federal Government's Productivity Commission figures, which are due for release in January, so I can't compare the current years. But you can rest assured that in relation to assaults, and I have the current annual report from the police force that was tabled in Parliament here, assaults have increased by a further 10+% on what they were last year. In 2008-9 there was about 11,000 police in Victoria. Many of those are senior people and people in management, non-operational roles, which leaves about between 7,500 and 8,000 frontline police. In that same year, there were 2,791 assault police charges laid and 2,698 charges of resisting, obstructing or hindering police in the course of their duties. Now, as I say, those statistics aren't mine, they're the Victoria Police Force's, and they're tabled in Parliament, and if they're wrong, they've made the Minister inadvertently mislead the Parliament, so I'd pretty much back them as being accurate. So those numbers effectively mean that about 40% of frontline police officers in this state were assaulted in that year. And almost the same number were physically resisted, obstructed or hindered in the course of their duties in a 12-month period. Of course, many minor matters aren't reported and certainly not prosecuted. But what we do know is that in the Victoria Police Force every year, 1 in 12 police officers will receive a compensable work cover injury, which makes it the worst work cover record of any employer in Victoria. In the 157-year history of the Victoria Police Force, there have been 157 police officers die at work, 1 every 12 months, and more than 30 of those have been murdered. Policing is often a violent business, whether we like it or not. Now, we hear and see a lot about public assaults, and while crime in general is on the way down, assaults in Victoria continue to rise. The shameful side of Melbourne and our major cities is now captured on CCTV more and more often and played in our lounge rooms on the nightly news. And it must be said, to be fair, that violence has always been present in Victoria. There's always been places you didn't go, people you didn't mix with or even speak to for that matter. But we've never seen the savagery of assaults that we see today and in recent times. We've never seen groups of young males catching trains into the city with the sole purpose of committing acts of violence against total strangers for no apparent reason, other than their apparent enjoyment from beating someone senseless. We've witnessed, only a matter of weeks ago, the attempted abduction of a 13-year-old girl at Flinders Street railway station at 6:15 p.m. on a Friday evening, peak hour. We've seen a returned soldier, home uninjured from Afghanistan, walking down the street with his girlfriend, have his face slashed with a box cutter knife by a total stranger for no apparent reason. Now, once these things were unthinkable, but now we see so much of them, people are inclined to say, oh, there's another one, or just make no comment at all. Certainly in years gone by, if someone was knocked to the ground, only the lowest of the low would put the boots into them. There was no action more certain to end in derision or exclusion from a group than kicking a defenceless person when they were down. Now it seems to be the done thing. But not just kicking defenceless people while they're down, but the new and frightening practice of stomping on people's heads. And we've seen it on TV footage where the only thing beneath that person's head is the concrete. In many ways, closed-circuit TV vision has made public assaults the Vietnam War of the 21st century. It's beamed into our lounge rooms and we see it graphically. Florence Nightingale, funny person to quote in a talk like this, once said that the first duty of any hospice is to do its patients no harm. And I think that holds good for governments, that the first duty of a government is that it protects its own citizens. It's the basic right of every person in this room and every person within the borders of Victoria to be able to walk the streets with safety. And it doesn't matter where on the political scale you sit, it doesn't matter what colour Guernsey you wear in Parliament House, it's the responsibility of any government. There's little point really in saying we have the best transport system or the best health or education system if your son gets beaten to death in a city street on his 18th birthday. It does him no good and it does you no good. In a statement about 30 years before Florence uttered that sentence, back in 1829, a fellow by the name of Sir Richard Mayne, who was the first Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police Force, had this to say: "The primary object of an efficient police is the prevention of crime, the next that of detection. To these ends, all the efforts of police must be directed. The protection of life and property, the preservation of public tranquillity and the absence of crime will alone prove whether those efforts have been successful and whether the objects for which police were appointed have been attained." Now, I think that statement holds as good today as it did 181 years ago. But times have changed, and as I've said, the levels of violence we witness today are more vicious and prevalent than in years gone by. And this includes violence against police, who are usually the unknown assault victims. And if police are being assaulted, they're not available to assist in attaining the aims of Sir Richard and our modern society. They're not available to assist in the battle for law and order and community safety. The demands on police are greater now than ever before. Accountability levels are higher than ever before, and so they should be, and I don't shy away from that. But the Victoria Police Force is now subject to 7 separate oversight bodies, some, if not most of which, have far greater powers than police do. That said, police are vested with powers that aren't available to the average citizen. But we should also remember that we have a model of policing by consent, and that is that police hold those powers because the majority of the community want them to. And they want them to so that they can do a job on their behalf. It's just as self-evident that doing an increasingly more complex job on behalf of others is difficult. There's no denying that. But people join the police force with a motivation to help others, not as a power trip and not in order that they can receive paper bags full of vast sums of cash from colourful racing identities. People do, believe me, join the police force in order to try and help people. So if their motivation for being police is helping others, and they're there with the consent and or encouragement of the community, then what holds them back? Well, one, the fact that for the last 7 years, Victoria, on a police to population ratio, has had the smallest police force in Australia out of any state or territory in the Commonwealth. That's obviously a major factor, and they're Federal Government Productivity Commission figures, not mine. That's not my propaganda. Those figures show that Victoria has 2.5 police officers for every 1,000 people in the community. 2.5 police for every 1,000 people, and that includes every resident, every tourist, every visitor from interstate, overseas, people here on visas, temporary visas, and those who are here illegally as well. Operationally, because of the issue I mentioned earlier about management and senior police officers not being on the front line, it's closer to less than 2 police, frontline police, per 1,000 head of population. 2, the fact that there's policies in schools, and I was a school council president for 11 years, and I know this to be the case because the principal used to bemoan this fact to me quite often, that students can't be expelled from the state system unless the principal organises another school that will take them. If I was principal of the prospective school, it's a fair chance I'd say if they can't handle that kid, I don't want to import their problems here. So the schoolyard bully's never sanctioned beyond a quiet talking to, and he grows into the youth who believes he can do as he wishes, including savagely belting someone or driving a motor car at Mach 3. These people need to be educated what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable and what's criminal. And I say criminal rather than, and I don't like doing this, but I will, inappropriate, because for mine, inappropriate refers to bad hat and handbag selection at the Spring Carnival, not to criminal assaults. The trouble with education programs, and there's no doubt there are troubles, the main trouble is that they take a long time, that change will be generational. Nevertheless, we have to do it, and the time to start is right now, because if we don't, then we sell off our unborn down the track. In the meantime, as a popular morning radio breakfast personality once said, we need to ask ourselves what good ever came from being in a licensed premises at 3 a.m. Clearly the European-style sale of, cafe-style sale of liquor that was thought to be the end result of our liquor licensing reforms hasn't envisaged. It hasn't just turned into a midnight frangelica and cup of coffee after the theatre, and what we're left with now, in the main, are 24-hour-a-day booze barns. And many of these places create an unlimited supply of drunks or people affected by drugs. I mean, once upon a time, ecstasy was the name of the hood ornament on a Rolls Royce. Now it's the cheap alternative to a night on the grog, manufactured by thousands in garages and sheds, and our kids are swallowing them because they're cheap at less than $30 a pop. And the result? People are either aggressive enough to start a fight, or to want to start a fight, or even the more sinister alternative is the people who are so affected by drugs or alcohol that they are easily preyed upon by bands of marauding assailants because they simply can't defend themselves. When things go terribly wrong, it is always the police who are the first called. Police who simply are not mental health professionals, they are not counsellors, they are not social workers, they're police. But they are expected to have all of the answers and techniques immediately available to deal with every imaginable crisis, and in probably more than 95% of the times that crisis is not one of their creation. And the issue here is that there's been a whole lot of individuals and organisations that have failed that mentally ill or disadvantaged person long before the police were called. Yet we all know what makes the best headlines in newspapers, and regardless of the fact that many of these situations could have been prevented years and years before. So a police force is a microcosm of the community it serves. Police officers aren't a combination of Henry Kissinger, Chuck Norris, Sherlock Holmes and Martha Gardner. They're just ordinary people trained to do a job, and they try and do it the best they can. And violence has a major impact on policing. After being repeatedly involved in violent confrontations, you can't blame someone who then starts to approach every situation on the defensive or more assertively than they did when they first began in their occupation. When a police officer is confronted with a violent or potentially violent situation, they revert to their training, and that training says that in many instances, the best defensive weapon is the human voice. Unfortunately, not everybody wants to listen. And there are still people in the community who believe that armed and aggressive people can be shot in the leg or police can shoot the weapon out of their hand. Well, I'm sorry, those sorts of things were done by John Wayne and Gary Cooper in black and white westerns, but they are impossible to do in real life. Police, like every other person in our community, have the right to go home after work. And if they're not to become more assertive and naturally defensive in the performance of their functions on behalf of the community, then that community must demand that those who are convicted of committing violent crimes are punished with the full force of the law by our courts. We've tried social engineering experiments, and by any measure, unfortunately, they've failed dismally. Police do want to do the job the right way, believe it or not, they do. They don't want to be involved in violent and sometimes fatal confrontations. As a community, we can lessen the instances of violence amongst us, but until we return to acceptable standards of behaviour and get sensible legislation, resources and equipment, no one, in my view, has the right to demand that a police officer put their life on the line in order to protect them in the law and order war. For that, for mine, would be the cruelest of discrimination, the discrimination of unfair expectation. No frontline police officer knows what awaits them in the course of their shift. They know that they're there to protect and assist the community, and they know their actions will be placed under closer scrutiny than any other occupation in this state. It's not always an easy job, and there's more police in the post-traumatic stress disorder ward at the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital than there are soldiers. They know the dangers in what they do, but they do it anyway, and thank God they do. We can imagine the state of law and order that we'd have.